looking at evidence for the Bible in some form or another. If you believe that the Bible is true, if you think that you might believe that the Bible is true, if you've ever pondered at any time whether you think the Bible is true, you've come across directly or indirectly this crucial issue of, is the Bible text that you have in front of you or in your hands at the moment actually what it says it is? Or to put it another way, is the Bible text that we have today anywhere near the Bible text that was written down 2,000 or more than 2,000 years ago by the people who wrote it? And whether you've accepted that that's, yes it is, whether you've ducked the question and you think that you'll pretend that you don't know the answer, that's okay as well. If you actually had some genuine concerns about whether or not the Bible is what it is telling us it is, then for the next half an hour or so we're going to see whether we can explore some of those issues. And I'm just going to reframe the question a little bit and put it like this. Is it actually possible for the Bible text to be trusted? Or to put it another way as well, if all we have in our hands, in our laps today, are copies of old manuscripts, or to be more accurate, if all we have are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of old manuscripts, and we could go on for a few more minutes as well, then again, is it reasonable to accept what's here that's actually what's right, and can we put it back together again in any way that seems to make sense? Hopefully we can, and we'll have some fun doing it, I hope. And with that in mind, let me introduce you to my mother. Those of you who have met my mum know that that's life size. My mum is an eccentric baker. She's not one of those people that disappears into the kitchen and whips up a three-course meal. It's not on purpose. She's one of those people that when she goes into the fridge or the freezer, pulls out something which she's absolutely convinced is beef mince, turns out to be apple stew, that kind of thing. You're never completely sure what you're going to get with my mother, as much as she's sometimes very entertaining when that happens. One day my mother disappeared into the kitchen and she decided that she would bake a cake, and she made, somewhat to everybody's surprise, a quite stunning lemon cake. So good, in fact, that the 5 people that she had around at her house at the time all wanted to know what the lemon cake was made of. So she copied the recipe out for them and gave all 5 of her friends a copy of the lemon cake recipe each. It was so good that each of these 5 friends gave the recipe to 2 more of their friends. Now I know you've just had lunch and it's warm and the sun is shining outside, so let's just make sure we're okay with this. That's my mum. Those are her 5 friends. They've each got a copy, and these are the friends' friends, and there's another 10 copies there. So how many is that altogether? 5 copies of the lemon cake recipe, and there are 10 copies of the lemon cake recipe. Everybody okay so far? It's not going to get much worse, but I'm just making sure that you're all there. My mother, despite being a slightly eccentric cook, is also one of these people who leaves windows open. She likes fresh air, and not surprisingly, when you leave windows open in the kitchen, all of a sudden her lemon cake recipe blew out of the window one day and disappeared off down the road. Stunning though you might imagine it to be, and maybe this is just the company she keeps, all 5 of her friends who had lemon cake recipes also left their windows open, or indeed fed them to the dog, and suddenly 5 copies of lemon cake recipes also disappeared. It's not very believable, this story, but it's trying to make a point, and hopefully we can just stick with it for the time being. So we've suddenly lost our original recipe. Or to use what historians would call, we've actually lost our autograph copy, the one that was written down by the person who came up with the recipe. And we've also lost our 5 immediate copies that you would think have got the most chance of being accurate. What we do have, somewhere, depends where they are, but what we do have are 10 copies of lemon cake recipe. I'm mentioning lemon cake because I know that you're a bit of a lemon cake fan as well, so I'll just throw that out there. It would have been chocolate cake if you'd not been there. Well, enter me. I like lemon cake, as Sheila actually knows very well. And the fact that my mother has managed to make a lemon cake which blows my mind and then lose the recipe makes me rather upset. So I have to then go and track down, the only way I know how, to track down the 10 copies of lemon cake recipe to manage to, if I can, to put my recipe, put the lemon cake recipe back together. And so I send emails, I make phone calls, I pay house visits, and I managed to come up with 9 of the 10. Which is a pretty good result, actually, when you think about it. And again, when you think about the kind of company that my mother keeps, that's probably a pretty good result. So I look at these and I bring them all together, and my main challenge is, can I put back together again the original lemon cake recipe that my mum came up with? And for the most part, these recipes all look roughly the same. I suppose there's only so far wrong you can go with the lemon cake recipe. Now, one of them uses pounds and ounces, whereas the others all use grams and kilograms. So in one sense, the first one of these recipes is actually slightly different from the other 8. Now, I guess a question for you, again, just to check you're all still with it. Does that make a material difference to how that lemon cake is going to be baked? all other things being equal. The fact that one of them uses pounds and ounces and the other uses grams and kilograms. What do we think? My wife says no, but that's because she likes lemon cake too. It's not going to make a material difference because we can just convert, so there's not actually much of a problem there. But when we look into it a little bit further, we actually notice that one or two of the recipes have got things in a slightly different order. So one of them might say that you sift the flour and then stir it in, and the others might say that you stir it in without actually bothering to sift. Now again, at the risk of being told off by people who always think you have to sift flour before it goes into a cake, does that make a material difference to the way in which the lemon cake is going to be made? Not really. You might say that there's a minute, tiny difference, but for the most part, no. When we look a bit closer, we find that one of these recipes is actually being copied out by person number 3, who's actually an American. And Americans, as we all know, have slightly different techniques when it comes to spelling. They use words like colour that seem to be spelt wrong, for example, and herbs seem to be pronounced altogether differently, although there were no herbs in this lemon cake. And actually, when I look at this third recipe, I look at it and I think that the spellings look a little bit erratic when it comes to the bulk of the others. So again, question for you, does that make a material difference to the way that the lemon cake is likely to be repackaged when we build it together again? Not really. Despite what Americans would tell us, the spelling doesn't really matter. And actually, when I look closely into that lemon cake recipe that's done with the American spelling, I notice that there's another discrepancy, that they've used cup measurements. And people who bake know that American cup measurements are basically for people who can't count, and you just scoop it in and dump it in the bowl, as opposed to actually having to measure stuff out. But again, question for everybody, does that make a material difference? Despite my insults to all races, creeds and colours that are not in this room today, no, it doesn't really. And I guess the point being is we can reconstruct the lemon cake recipe despite one or two minor differences. So not surprisingly, I'm happy, everybody's happy, and we can eat lemon cake because we've managed to put it back together again. Now that's a very silly example, but it's designed to make a really important point. That even though we might find that the copies of the lemon cake recipe have a number of very minor discrepancies between each other, actually it doesn't matter too much when trying to reconstruct that original recipe. And the same comes when we begin to look at the Bible, when we enter what's called the dark arts of textual criticism, and we try to figure out exactly how the Bible itself was put together. That there are a lot of copies of Bible manuscripts out there, but for the very, very overwhelming majority of those, the discrepancies between them are so minor as to not make any material difference. And that's the test that we're going to use for the next few minutes this afternoon. Does it make a material difference when I try to figure this stuff out? Is there something in the way of me understanding it? Or is it merely a minor textual difference that we can figure out together? And hopefully we will see that on the balance of probability, which is really the test that we've applied there, most things that we're looking at are okay. So with that in mind, let's have a look at the manuscript availability for the Bible. Because the crucial point, I suppose, to take away is this, that historical sources are only as good, only as strong, as the records on which they stand. And the evidence for the New Testament manuscripts in particular is extremely strong when compared with evidence for other manuscripts of other authored works that exist from the time. And one or two of you know I have a bit of an obsession with this. I'm going to try to limit the obsession this afternoon, but it is really quite, I think, important when we think about how this stuff works. This gentleman with the beard here is Arrian. He was one of the key biographers of Alexander the Great. The gentleman with no head, or only half a head, is Plutarch. It's Plutarch, and he was also a second biographer of Alexander the Great, and they were both writing more than 400 years after the events of Alexander the Great's life that they were describing. They are the two key records for Alexander the Great. So if you want to go and find out about his conquest of India and the way in which he marched across the ancient world, causing havoc in his wake, and became known as one of the greatest military commanders that there's ever been in the history of the world, then you have to go and look in particular at these two people. And yet they're writing more than 4 centuries after the events that they describe. So in terms of a gap between events taking place and records surviving, that's quite a long time. And I guess that's the point that I want to try to draw home from this, is that that's a very long time between events taking place and the records that they describe. Anybody recognise his character? This is Tacitus, and he wrote some annals. He wrote them in about 100 AD, round about 100 AD. The earliest manuscript for the Annals of Tacitus comes from about 850 AD. And then there's a gap to the next one, which is about the middle of the 11th century. So we've got 3/4 of a millennium between the events that he describes when he's actually writing this stuff down and the first surviving manuscript. In other words, you have to take on trust the fact that in that 750-year period, nothing's been changed. That's a massive amount of time. given the way in which historians of the time lean on him for his evidence. Anybody recognise this person? This is Pliny. He wrote letters, including describing what was happening when Mount Vesuvius was erupting. It's about 400 years between the events which he describes, Mount Vesuvius in particular, and the folio, the first surviving folios in the middle of the 5th century for the records of the letters of Pliny. Less than some of the others, but still significantly a long time. You might recognise him. It's Josephus. When I say you might recognise him, you're all meant to say, yes, we recognise him. Finally, we found an old bloke with no hair. Yes, that's Josephus, the primary record for the Jewish wars of the 1st century. So anybody who ever understands what some of the prophecies of the New Testament, which when they're describing the fall of Jerusalem, you turn to Josephus because he's the key person. The earliest surviving records of Josephus or the events that Josephus describes, come about 1000 AD. And there are 9 surviving manuscripts in the 10th and 11th centuries. That's even bigger. And no doubt all of you have a copy of Homer, Homer's Iliad on your bedside table. He's got the best beard of the lot. In fact, he looks like he's been attacked by an octopus. And even though the manuscripts from Homer's Iliad are around about 200 or 300 AD, the events which he's recording, or the time in which he's writing rather, is about 800 BC. So we've got a millennium between the events being written down and the record actually first surviving to us. That's the equivalent of me saying, take a pen or paper, write down your recollection of the Norman Conquest. 1066 and all that, write down a couple of paragraphs and tell me what you think. And it's based entirely on hearsay. In other words, we don't doubt these people exist, we don't doubt their records of history, we don't start to question whether or not things have happened, although we do filter it through a particular lens, but the enormous point has to be there's a very big gap between the events that they record and the first record that we actually have of what they say. Anybody know the gap between the New Testament being written down and the first surviving full manuscript that we have? Bearing in mind the numbers I've thrown out at you, you're going to have to hope it's going to be less. First surviving 2 manuscripts, in fact, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, and they both date to about 350. So when we compare with 1,000, 850, 750, this is considerably smaller. It's still not that small, and we'll have a go in a minute at making it a bit smaller. But the first full surviving manuscript of the New Testament is Codex Sinaiticus, and it was found, not surprisingly, in the Sinai around 350 AD, and I'm not being too precise with the dates, just to make life easy for everybody, but round about 350. So we've closed the window. And I guess the key point with this is, to what extent can you narrow the gap between the events which are being described and the record first being available? Because the narrower that gap, the less chance people have got of interfering with the record. The less chance there is of legend entering in, of somebody saying, oh, actually Alexander didn't just conquer India, but he also went to the moon, and he was an intergalactic space warrior, or whatever else might have filtered in over the years. This is only 300 years or thereabouts from the close of the New Testament. Sorry, 250 years from the close of the New Testament, and that's a considerably smaller window. But we can push it back, I think, even further than this. And we talked about things being life-size earlier. This is spectacularly not life-size. This is the John Rylands Papyrus number 52, and it's about that big. And it's about that wide. It's about the size of your credit card. And you can go and see it in the John Rylands Library in Manchester. I went to see it a few months ago. It is that size. It's impossible to find. They don't signpost it in any way. And when you see it, it doesn't look particularly exciting. But in 1920, the University of Manchester did what universities have a habit of doing, buying a bunch of old stuff and then sticking it in a cupboard. And they bought a whole bunch of manuscripts from Egypt in 1920, and nobody looked at them until 1934, when a man named Colin Williams came along and began to look through the box full of manuscripts, and he came across this one, as I say, size of a credit card, not particularly spectacular, didn't seem to shine out in any way, until he realised that on the front side were some verses from John chapter 18, John 18, 31 to 33 in particular. And then, even more surprising, he noticed that on the other side were some other verses from John 18, verses 37 and 38, which was remarkable for a number of reasons. The first of which was that until that point nobody trusted John as being part of the Gospels, because the assumption was that the Gospel was written in about 380 AD, i.e. centuries and centuries and centuries after the events that John is supposedly recording, and therefore you couldn't trust it. But interestingly, when the man at the University of Manchester discovered that this was printed, or written rather, on 2 sides, he realised that this was telling him something remarkable. Anybody want to have a guess, just again to keep you awake, at what that remarkable something might have been? My wife said this before, so I'm hoping she knows the answer. Can't be a scroll. That's the key point. He realised that if it's written on 2 sides, you know how a scroll works, it's written on one side and you roll it up and look at it and you roll it back together again and stick it back on the shelf. This is written on 2 sides, meaning it's a book, or meaning specifically it's a codex. Now, Christianity's never been at the technological forefront of anything, except for at the end of the 1st century, when the codex was just coming into fashion and the scroll was just falling out of fashion, and in particular down the Nile in Egypt, where this was originally discovered. And Colin Williams looked at this and he realised that not only had he got something remarkable that was clearly earlier than any John manuscript that had existed before, but also that he'd got something which was, believe it or not, Christianity at the cusp of technological innovation. Hasn't happened since, you might be thinking in your head. But he looked at this and he sent it to 4 experts that he knew across Europe. 3 of them came back and said, we reckon it's dated to about 150 to 200 AD. Now, even that in itself is remarkable because it had considerably narrowed the gap between 380 or thereabouts, which was the original estimate for John, and when John must have been writing. The 4th person came back and said, no, I think you can date this even earlier. I think you can date this to about 90 AD. Now, it depends when you think John writes Revelation as to when that falls. If you're one of the people that thinks John writes Revelation around about AD 85 or AD 90, then you've got something that may well have been written in the lifetime of John himself, copied out in the lifetime of John himself, or certainly in the lifetime of the next generation down. Now, in a world where if something happens, you get a flash on your phone about 15 seconds after it happens. I was at the cricket on Friday night and I watched a wicket fall in real time, and about 8 seconds later my phone buzzed to tell me a wicket had fallen. That's how quickly technology picks up news these days. But the very fact that we got a manuscript 1 generation or thereabouts after John's death was the ancient world equivalent of a news flash. In other words, it made it almost impossible for the records, the manuscript of John, the Gospel of John, to have been tampered with in any way. And when you think about it, to be found, well, where's John writing his letters? Where does John write Revelation? Probably. Where does John write his Gospel? Almost certainly on the Isle of Patmos, in other words, in the Eastern Mediterranean. This is a manuscript which is found all the way down the Nile River, where there's a large Christian community, so word has spread to that extent that manuscripts of John are floating around at that time, and people are using them to understand and to read and to recognise the message of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's an ancient world newsflash. And when we're talking about narrowing the gap, when we're talking about 1,000 years between events which are being described and the record first being available, suddenly we've got something which is 30, 40, 50 years. The estimate now for this is about 125 or 130 AD. Things have kind of normalised. But as I say, even with that, we're still talking about a manuscript available 1 generation after John himself is writing this stuff down. And that's like a heartbeat in the ancient world, and we should get really excited about that, because it's proof, as close as you can almost get, that these kind of things are being told. It takes us really to the beating heart of the gospel message, and it's really quite important. And we could push that further. I mean, there are about 300 manuscripts available before the end of the 3rd century. That apply. About 300 New Testament manuscripts available before the end of the 3rd century. Which, again, when you think about the number of things available from other authors, that's really quite significant. There's 8 copies of Herodotus, there's 7 copies of Aristotle, there's 20 copies of Tacitus. Before the end of the 3rd century, there are 24,000 copies or fragments or bits of copies or codices or other bits and pieces of the New Testament kicking around. That's massive. They're not all immediately after the events, and a lot of them are dated after 1066, for example. But just the sheer number available. Once you have numbers, you can start to cross compare. Once you can start to cross compare, you can do the lemon cake thing and thrash out where the errors are and get a tighter and more accurate record of what was originally written down. When you've only got 6 or 7, you can't do that, or at least you can only do it to a very limited extent. When you've got 24,000 bits, you can start to knock out the errors much more quickly and take a line of best fit, as it were, down the middle for what people seem to be available. That's huge. And again, it should get us excited. It should make us confident about what we actually have in front of us. that it's really what it says on the tin. And when you think about the New Testament record, the number of copies, the age of the copies, the different languages of the copies, i.e. the very fact that you can cross-compare across languages is important. The number of copies of the copies that exist are far in excess of anything available from any other author in any other part of the ancient world. It's massively important for how we understand things. F.F. Bruce said there's no body of ancient literature in the world that enjoys such a wealth of good textual attestation as the New Testament. The kids were trying to read that phrase earlier on when they were looking through my slides, and I think they came a cropper over that second part. Basically, it's the best you can get. If you wanted to hold up a gold standard for way manuscripts have been transmitted, you would actually look to the Bible. You look specifically to the New Testament for what's available. It's absolutely huge in terms of what's available and how important that is. There's no other body of literature in the world that is as convincing for us as the New Testament actually is. I just want to push this a little bit further. We've been thinking about the number of copies. In other words, we've been looking from the outside. What about if we look to the inside? Let me just try to draw for you on the map what things look like in terms of those the first two characters we had, Arian and Plutarch. So Alexander dies about 323 BC. Ministry of the Lord is about AD 30. Again, we'll push these numbers a little bit. Plutarch's the first person who writes, or the earliest person rather, who's writing a history of Alexander. In other words, that's the red line we're trying to deal with. We're thinking about narrowing the gap as best we can. That's a pretty massive red line. We're looking at 450 years or thereabouts, depending on when he writes his record down. Well, let's think about the New Testament for a minute. What is the... How do I ask this question to you? How does the book of Acts finish? The book of Acts obviously is the preaching record of the New Testament. How does the book of Acts finish? Paul in Rome. What do we know? Do we know anything else of Paul? We know how Paul dies. We know that Paul dies in Rome. It's not part of the biblical record, but we know Paul dies in Rome, and we know that he can't die much after AD 65 or AD 66, something like that. Now, we're not worried too much about that date, but I guess the point being, if Paul, as a number of other records testify, dies before AD 70 in Rome, and the book of Acts writes a dozen chapters about Paul's preaching record, but doesn't include his death, then the obvious assumption has to be that when Luke is writing Acts, and he finishes Acts 28 with Paul under house arrest in Rome, Paul is still alive. Can't imagine that Luke would have finished writing Acts and not recorded that Paul died at the hands of the Jews or the Romans, if indeed he had done. In other words, Book of Acts must be dated to before AD 70. Is that a reasonable way of working that out? Doesn't seem too much of a jump. That you would surely have recorded the death of Paul rather than leaving us, as it were, hanging with him being under house arrest in Rome. In other words, let's put that down. If you date Acts to about AD 62, which seems to be the common assumption, well, there's the ministry of the Lord Jesus. Now, the thing is, Acts is not the first thing that Luke writes. Luke is the first thing that Luke writes. So just to get this on the screen, we've got Luke there as well. Now, there may not be a year between them, but just for the sake of argument, let's say that there is. We also know that Luke is not the first gospel to be written. And there seems to be an almighty scholarly agreement, such as there ever is, that Mark is the first gospel to be written. And even just allowing for an extra year to count backwards, we've got Mark to about AD 60. You can be picky with the dates and push them 5 years either way if you want, but the point is, that's a very small red arrow, compared with the massive red arrow that we had on the screen for the records of Alexander the Great. That's really important because, again, what we've got is in Luke, we've got an assumption, an internal assumption rather than an external assumption now, that what we're looking at is a record that can be dated to within a generation of the ministry and the death and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, the Lord Jesus Christ, depending on what you prefer to call him. And again, we've managed to get that window down. This is all about narrowing a gap. This is all about saying the less time there is between the event taking place and the record first being written down, then the less chance there is of somebody mucking around with the record, changing things, adding things in, saying actually Jesus was a remarkable person when he really wasn't, or whatever people think might have happened. And we've managed to just break that down and make that a little bit smaller. And that's really quite helpful. Now we can do that again with the reading that we shared together in 1 Corinthians 15. Maybe I can just get you to come across and have a look with me. I'm going to put it on the screen as well, so feel free just to stare at the screen. But if you want to have a look in your own Bible, just come and have a look with me. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And Paul tells us a number of things here about this key phrase, or these key phrases rather, that he talks to us about. Because the Gospels weren't the first records, weren't the first parts of the New Testament, I don't think, that were ever written down. And the assumption seems to be that the letters of Paul were circulating in the AD 40s, AD 50s, in other words, prior to those Gospels that we just had on the screen a moment ago, being written down as well. And what we've got here, and what we're trying to find out is, are there signs in Paul's writings that he's using earlier records of something, things even closer to the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth than that 30-year gap that we had on the screen a moment ago? And I think the answer is yes, there is. There are indications in 1 Corinthians 15, and Paul uses quite technical language here to describe what he has, or what he experiences. I delivered to you, he says, as of first importance, what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and then he appeared to all of these people that he lists out for us. Certain things I just want you to hook out from there. One of the things is that it's something that Paul describes of being as of first importance. English Standard Version says it was the primary doctrine. It was the one thing above all things that Paul needed to emphasize in his teaching. And he says that he passed it on to the Corinthians. But it's not where it finishes, because he also tells us that he himself received this teaching from other people before he passed it on to the Corinthians. He was delivered to you that was of first importance, that which I also received, he says. And what was that? Well, it's this teaching here, that Christ died and he was buried and he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. So before the time that Paul is writing his Corinthian letter, which is in the mid-40s AD, Paul has been given this truth that Jesus died and was buried and was raised again the third day. We've not got a full New Testament manuscript. We've not even got a single book manuscript. What we've got is the kernel of the gospel, there in 2.5, 3 lines, that Paul tells us not only did he pass on to others at this very early stage, but also it was something that he himself received of other people. Now again, we can begin to chart this on the map. There's the ministry of the Lord. Paul is converted. Well, it depends how you want to read your book of Acts as to when Paul is converted, but you can't make it much later than AD 32 without somehow inventing something to shove into the middle of the book of Acts to make that gap a bit bigger. We know that then Paul, when he's converted, goes into Arabia, and wherever he really went, he then goes to Jerusalem, where he meets the apostles. And if we add 3 years to about AD 32, we get AD 35. Now, that arrow is so small I can't even get it on the screen. So we've not got a manuscript, we've not even got a book, we've got the kernel of the gospel being passed on a couple of years at the most after the ministry of Jesus. In other words, we've got the gap down for teachings being communicated that form the very core of the gospel. And although we might not ourselves read those verses and tease those points out, the point, I guess, to emphasize is, if we're concerned that the gospel message, i.e. the fact that Jesus didn't just die, but also that he was raised from the dead, was somehow invented 500 years later by people who had an axe to grind against somebody else, well, actually that's not true. Because the message that Jesus Christ died and was buried and he rose again on the third day was communicated in some form to the Apostle Paul 18 months, 24 months after Jesus of Nazareth died in around AD 30. That's huge. That's less than a heartbeat of a heartbeat in terms of how we view these records. It's a way of convincing us, above anything else, that this stuff is actually what it says in the pages of our Scriptures. And if we're the kind of people who've never doubted this, or we've accepted this, and well, that's fine, and you're in a great position when you think about that. If you're the kind of person who says, you know what, I'm not convinced that this stuff has been passed on without somebody fiddling around with the record, without embellishment, without somebody adding a few wings here and there, or a few intergalactic moon trips, or whatever we were talking about a few moments ago, well then this seems to be the evidence, as close as we can get, using the kind of evidence that historians would trust, that this is a smaller gap really as it's possible to get. Essential Christian beliefs, one writer says, somebody who actually is not convinced of the gospel. Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. It goes again to underline the point. You can't actually get away from the fact that these things are there, however much we want to change them. Now, I said half an hour, I've had half an hour, I'm going to buy about 3 or 4 minutes off Andrew, if I may, just to gallop backwards for a moment and make one final point about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because we thought almost exclusively about the New Testament, and we would be remiss if we only thought about that. back in 1947, as most, if not all of you will know, an Arab goat herder threw a stone into a cave, and he expected it to make a clunk, and instead it made a crack, because he'd thrown the stone against a whole bunch of clay jars. And when he climbed up to find out what on earth that noise was all about, he found inside the clay jars a whole series of 1st century, or prior to that, manuscripts, which later became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, before that point, the oldest complete manuscript of the Old Testament in Hebrew was, as I'm sure you were all absolutely aware of already, the Leningrad Codex of 1008, and it's the oldest complete manuscript. There is one a little bit earlier, but it's not complete. So that's the oldest complete manuscript of the Old Testament in Hebrew. And just for the record, this was really just an excuse to put some nice pictures of old stuff on the screen, and I liked this one, which is why it's staying up there. That's what the Dead Sea Scroll or the Isaiah Scroll looks like, the Great Isaiah Scroll. Not quite sure why I've got that on the screen other than to show you what it looks like. Here's the window. So if the Old Testament ends at about 400 BC, and again, you could fiddle around with that number if you wanted to be very precise. But if it finishes about 400, there's the ministry of Jesus. There's the Leningrad Codex. There's the red arrow. We're talking about making it small. Up until 1947, you had to take on trust that that was a reasonable history gap, that there was nothing at all prior to that point which has somehow jumped in and started to change the Old Testament. And it would not have been unreasonable for you to have said, hang on a minute, 1,000 years for all of these other people with big beards, and you're still talking about the Old Testament at 1,400 years. Well, what the Dead Sea Scrolls did was that they were dated to somewhere between 200 or 100 BC. I mean, it depends which one you look at as to the specific date. That gets the gap right down. And I guess the point having been made so many times that the differences between the records which were currently being used then and the Leningrad Codex and documents that followed later of the New Testament, there were virtually no significant differences between the older Dead Sea Scrolls and the much later manuscripts, i.e. the Old Testament could be trusted, just in the same way that we've been saying that the New Testament could be trusted. And also, and it gave us a new light on how we view the Septuagint as well. And up until that point, the Septuagint was just the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and you couldn't really trust it because, well, nobody really knew what to do with it. Well, actually, suddenly you could compare the Dead Sea Scrolls here with the Septuagint here, and it looked really quite reasonable, and the arrow got even smaller. We've been talking all the way through about how do I manage to get the gap down? How do I manage to bridge that gap and make it as small as possible between the events which are being described and the manuscripts that actually describe them? The bigger the gap, the less reliable the history. The smaller the gap, the more reliable the history, the more you can trust the records which have been written down. We've seen it for the New Testament, we've seen it for the Old Testament, and as one writer says, the textual evidence of the Dead Sea Scrolls confirms the general reliability and stability of the text of the Old Testament as we have it today. In other words, just as it was for the New Testament, the Old Testament is equally trustworthy, and therefore, because it holds together, we can begin to actually base our lives on it and make decisions on it based on what we read, rather than thinking, well, actually, surely the original writers didn't mean that after all. And that's huge for our discipleship. It's absolutely massive, because firstly, it means there's no hiding place, and we can't just pretend that it's not really there. Secondly, we have to look at it and say, well, if it is the most reliable source manuscript of the ancient world, and if it's claiming a number of key things about one individual in particular, about a creator as well, about the way in which men and women also should react accordingly and do something with their lives, then we have very little place to hide in terms of how we react to that. And it makes us, I think, want to look into this more, because it seems to be so reliable. So if the question at the beginning was, can you trust the Bible? Is the evidence for the Bible reasonable? Does it stack up? Is the lemon cake recipe convincing? Then I think the answer has to be, yes, it is. Thanks, Sam.